Close your eyes. Imagine a night older than memory itself. The air tastes of wood smoke and winter. Somewhere along the rivers of ancient Siberia, a small fire crackles under a sky wide enough to swallow every sound. A group of hunters huddle around it, warming their hands, sharing meat, trading stories without words. One of them throws a bundle of dried plants into the flames. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the smoke changes. It carries a strange sweetness, a warmth that sinks deeper than the skin. The men laugh, softly at first, then louder, as if the stars themselves had joined the conversation. One leans back, eyes half closed, trying to remember what was so funny. He never will. That was more than 7,000 years ago. And that accidental puff of smoke may have been the beginning of one of humanity's most complicated relationships. Long before anyone called it cannabis, before the word drug even existed, people were learning that this plant could make the world quieter or louder, depending on what they needed most. It's strange to think about it now, but at first there was nothing mystical about it. Cannabis wasn't rebellion or medicine or sin. It was simply useful. The stalks were strong and light, perfect for rope, cloth, nets. The seeds could be roasted, pressed, turned into oil. The leaves brewed into teas that soothed fevers, eased pain, or maybe just made the drinker forget they had either. By the time the first farmers began drawing boundaries in the dirt, hemp was already at home beside them. When they built homes, it became fiber for ropes and sails. When they buried their dead, they placed seeds beside the bodies, perhaps as an offering or as a reminder that comfort could grow from the ground. Archaeologists still find those seeds today, tucked into clay jars, carbon black and ancient, as if waiting for a world ready to understand them again. In the beginning, everything humans touched had two faces, food and poison, sacred and simple. Cannabis was no different. It offered strength for the living, calm for the dying, and questions for those who had time to think. It was a quiet teacher in a loud, unfinished world. But there's something poetic about it, isn't there? The idea that one of the first plants humans ever cultivated wasn't just for survival. It was for feeling, to hold stillness in your lungs, to taste time. And so, long before laws, before kingdoms, before temples, or the notion of forbidden fruit, the plant was there, growing wild along riverbanks, swaying under pale moons, patient, waiting. Thousands of years later, people would argue whether it was good or evil, healing or destructive. They would give it names, assign it moral weight, write it into law, banish it, rediscover it, worship it, forget it. But here, in this small, flickering circle of firelight, none of that exists yet. There are only the hunters, the stars, the warmth, and a plant that has just taught humanity a brand new way to breathe. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the silence between their laughter, the sound of something ancient beginning, a whisper curling through smoke, a seed waking inside the dark, the first leaf meeting fire. Now, drift with me a few thousand years forward, past the fading campfires of Siberia, through the first plowed fields of China, to the court of a man so curious he nearly poisoned himself in the name of progress. His name was Shen Nong, the divine farmer, and according to legend, he tasted every plant he could find, hundreds of them, searching for what could heal and what could harm. He did this not out of madness, but duty. He believed nature spoke through flavor, and if he could listen closely enough, he might learn the language of life itself. Around 2700 BC, in a China still building its myths, Shen Nong documented his discoveries in a great herbal compendium, the Pin Cao Qing. It would become the first known record of cannabis as medicine. He described the plant as balancing yin and yang, harmonizing body and mind, soothing pain, and undoing rheumatic afflictions. Modern science might call it anti-inflammatory. Shen Nong would have said it simply, return the soul to still water. He must have known the danger of such experiments. The story goes that he tried so many herbs that some days he turned purple from toxins and his body steamed from internal fire. Yet when he drank tea, a plant he also discovered, it saved him. Perhaps that's why centuries later, tea and cannabis would be spoken of as siblings, one for clarity, the other for peace. In ancient China, cannabis wasn't something to escape with, it was something to understand. Farmers grew hemp in long rows beside their rice fields. Monks boiled the seeds into gruel. Healers ground the leaves with honey to ease pain and anxiety. It was medicine, rope, paper, food, and occasionally mystery. Because sometimes those who brewed a bit too strong began to see strange things, patterns in the wind, voices in the rain, the sense that their ancestors were near. The line between treatment and transcendence blurred like smoke in a temple. Shen Nong's China wasn't the first to know cannabis, but it was the first to record it with respect. The plant was treated like a wise elder, one whose gifts required understanding, not indulgence. When people said it brought forgetfulness, they didn't mean the mind became dull. They meant the weight of life loosened its grip. Imagine that for a moment, a civilization measuring medicine not by chemistry, but by harmony. No pills, no dosage charts, just the question, does this make you whole again? And in that world of bronze and silence, hemp became woven into nearly everything. Robes, ropes, nets, scrolls, all carried the same whisper of green. It said the first maps of the Yellow River were drawn on hemp paper. The first sails that crossed its waters were hemp as well. Even the bows that defended China's early cities used hemp strings. The empire's progress was literally tied together by a plant. And while later dynasties would fight over silk, jade, and gold, this humble stalk continued growing quietly in every corner of the kingdom, steady, sturdy, uncomplaining. No one yet called it sacred. No one yet feared it. It was simply useful. But time has a strange way of turning the ordinary into myth. What begins as a crop ends as a symbol. And so, centuries later, when warriors and wanderers carried seeds westward along dusty roads, they weren't spreading rebellion. They were spreading civilization itself. The story of cannabis was about to leave the East, riding on camel caravans hidden among spices, bound for the great empires of the desert. The plant that once taught hunters how to laugh was now ready to teach kings how to dream. Now, imagine the air changing, no longer heavy with incense and paper dust, but sharp with horse sweat and the cold wind of endless plains. We're moving west now, away from China's ordered gardens and into the open, restless world of the Scythians. They were wanderers of the steppe, riders who lived beneath skies so wide they could lose a lifetime staring upward. To them, the earth was not something to own, but something to cross. They buried their dead in golden tombs and burned their fears in sacred fires. And among their most mysterious rituals was one the Greeks could never quite stop talking about. They bathed in smoke. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described it with both awe and confusion. He said that after burying their dead, the Scythians would crawl inside small tents, throw hemp seeds onto red hot stones, and delight themselves with the vapor. The smoke would fill the enclosure until no one could see. Then came the laughter, loud, rhythmic, unrestrained. To Herodotus, it looked like madness. To the Scythians, it was communion. Inside that dense mist, they believed the barrier between worlds thinned. The living could speak to ancestors, warriors could shed their pain, and sorrow itself could dissolve into air. Smoke, for them, was not an escape. It was a bridge. Archaeologists have since found proof that Herodotus wasn't exaggerating. In Scythian burial mounds across southern Siberia and Kazakhstan, they've uncovered golden vessels, small ornate bowls once used to burn cannabis. Inside some, residue of hemp and opium still clings to the metal, stubborn against time, as if the spirits themselves refuse to let go. Picture it, a warrior, his body scarred from battle, kneeling before the flames. He places the seeds on glowing stones, closes his eyes, and breathes. The scent rises, sweet, heavy, ancient. Around him, his companions begin to sway, their voices merging into something low and wordless. For a moment, they're not men anymore, but echoes. This was not the cannabis of modern conversation. There were no rolling papers or idle pastimes. It was ceremony, death, memory, transcendence. In a world where life could vanish with a single arrow, peace was something you summoned through smoke. And yet, even across centuries, there's a strange familiarity to it. A circle of people, firelight, laughter that borders on tears. Maybe the human instinct to gather and share stillness through smoke never truly left us. It only changed form. From the Scythian plains, the plant traveled further still, carried by merchants and soldiers, tucked into saddlebags beside salt and bronze, through Persia into Mesopotamia, then Egypt. Each land found its own reason to keep it close. Some saw medicine, some saw sin, but all saw power. By the time the Greeks wrote about it, cannabis had already conquered half the known world without ever lifting a sword. It's strange, isn't it? How something that grows quietly in the dirt can cross continents, reshape ritual, and whisper to gods across languages. If fire was humankind's first invention, perhaps smoke was its first prayer. The air changes again, this time warmer, thicker, perfumed with cardamom and sandalwood. We've left the windy steppes behind and stepped into ancient India. Sometime around 1500 BC, the land hums with color and rhythm. Bells, chants, 1,000 shades of sunlight spilling over stone temples. Here, cannabis found not warriors or emperors, but gods. In the sacred texts known as the Atharva Veda, it is called one of the 5 holy plants, a source of happiness, a liberator. They said it was given by the gods to help humans feel delight, to soften the edges of suffering. The word they used was bang. Unlike the Scythians, the people of India did not burn it in tents. They drank it. They crushed its leaves into a bright green paste, stirred it into milk, honey and spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, sometimes pepper, and offered it to Shiva, the Lord of transformation. Legend says that when the world became too noisy, too full of desires, Shiva wandered into the mountains to escape. Under a tall tree, he discovered the cannabis plant, ate its leaves, and found instant calm. From that day on, he was known as the Lord of Bhang. And so, during the festival of Mahashivaratri, millions still stay awake through the night, singing, dancing, and sipping that sacred drink in his honor. It is not indulgence, it is worship. They say it opens the mind to divine truth, but gently, like a door swinging in the wind. Imagine the scene, a courtyard under the moon, torches burning low, devotees in white robes passing cups from hand to hand. The bang is cool, sweet, a little bitter at the end. The air hums with voices, songs that sound like prayer or maybe laughter. Time slows. Faces blur into light. For a few hours, the border between heaven and earth dissolves completely. Unlike in other cultures, there was no shame here. Cannabis was not hidden behind curtains or whispered about in code. It was offered to gods, to guests, to one's own soul. And because India saw no divide between medicine and spirit, it became both. Monks used it to aid meditation. Healers used it to ease fever. Philosophers used it to think more slowly, and therefore more deeply. The plant grew wild across the plains and foothills, but it was the heart that turned it sacred. In a world that believed the divine could be tasted, cannabis became the flavor of balance. And while it would one day be outlawed, misunderstood, and exiled by those who feared it, India never really let it go. Even today, bhang shops line the streets during festivals, selling that same green mixture wrapped in flowers. A 3,000-year-old reminder that peace is sometimes simpler than we think. But as the plant story continued west, it began to change again. The more it traveled, the more it shed its divinity and took on human politics, laws, suspicions, empires. From here, the road leads to Persia, where priests burned it for prophecy, and to Egypt, where healers ground it into ointments for pain. Its journey would soon pass into Greece, Rome, and the pages of philosophers who tried to explain why a simple leaf could make people laugh, heal, and dream all at once. But for now, let's stay a little longer in the soft Indian night, where the stars shimmer like lanterns above temple roofs, and someone, somewhere, lifts a cup of bhang to their lips and whispers a small, timeless prayer. Peace in the mind, peace in the body, peace in the smoke. Let's drift north again, back into the misty mountains of ancient China, where the air tastes of pine, resin, and ink, and silence hangs between temple bells. Here, centuries after Shen Nong's experiments, cannabis found a new home among the seekers of the Tao. The Taoist monks believed every living thing carried a fragment of the universe's truth. Mountains whispered wisdom, rivers sang about time, and some plants, like hemp, helped mortals listen. To them, the smoke rising from a brazier wasn't just air turning to fire. It was a message on its way home. Old scrolls mention the liberator of sins, a blend of herbs that included cannabis. The monks burned it in incense, breathing slowly until thought itself grew soft. They said it helped them leave the body and travel the spirit realms, visions of golden bridges, spinning stars, and ancestors smiling in the dark. You might call it hallucination. They called it harmony. But not everyone in China approved of such mystical shortcuts. Across the valleys, Confucian scholars frowned from behind their bamboo screens. They preached discipline, duty, order, values that didn't pair well with drifting off to the cosmos mid-meditation. To them, cannabis was dangerous not because it harmed the body, but because it tempted the mind away from structure. And so began one of the earliest human contradictions, the debate between control and release, between those who said enlightenment must be earned through years of study, and those who believed it could arrive in a single exhale. The empire, ever practical, found a middle path. Hemp remained a crop of national importance, its fibers woven into clothing, its seeds pressed into oil, its paper used for official decrees. The same plant that floated monks toward heaven also supplied rope for the emperor's navy. By the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, hemp had become the silent backbone of China's civilization. The paper used by scholars to copy Confucius's teachings? Hemp. The ropes that tied merchant ships together along the Yangtze? Hemp. Even the kites children flew over spring fields, held by hemp string. It's almost funny to think that a single plant could serve both poetry and war, meditation and bureaucracy, but that's the nature of cannabis. It adapts. It doesn't rebel. It survives. Wherever humans go, it quietly reshapes itself to their needs. Somewhere in those mountain temples, a monk exhales a wisp of smoke, watching it curl toward the rafters. Somewhere else, a clerk dips his brush into ink made from soot and oil and writes down a law about taxes. The two moments are worlds apart, yet bound by the same stalk of fiber. And maybe that's the secret that the Taoists were trying to share, that everything, from prayer to paperwork, is connected. Even the sacred and the ordinary share the same roots. So when later travelers along the Silk Road packed hemp seeds into their saddlebags, they weren't smuggling magic. They were simply carrying a little piece of order and a little piece of chaos, balanced perfectly as all things should be. Soon, this unassuming plant would leave the monasteries and markets of China and ride west again, carried by camels and merchants, by mystics and conquerors. It would enter new languages, earn new names, and gather new myths. And though no one knew it yet, cannabis was about to become the first global traveler crossing deserts, kingdoms, and centuries without a single passport. Its next stop, Persia, where priests used it to see the future and poets used it to forget the past. The smoke was about to rise again. Now picture the desert, a horizon that stretches so far it bends. The wind moves like a whisper across sand, the color of bronze. And between two worlds, the east and the west, runs a thread of motion, the Silk Road. Camels sway under loads of silk, spices, glass, and gold. Merchants shout in a dozen languages, trading not just goods but stories, songs, and beliefs. And in their bundles, tucked between cinnamon bark and lapis lazuli, rides something far less glamorous but far more enduring, a handful of cannabis seeds. It was the perfect traveler. It didn't complain, didn't spoil, and when the caravan stopped, it could grow anywhere, by riverbanks, beside wells, even in the courtyards of caravansaries. Within a few generations, it had taken root from China to the Mediterranean, spreading not through conquest, but through conversation. In Persia, priests of the Zoroastrian faith began using it in rituals to open the mind to truth. They called it Bhangha, a cousin of the Indian bhang, but here it wasn't offered to gods. It was used to listen to them. The priest would sit by a sacred fire, inhale the smoke, and wait for visions. Some saw angels, some saw stars that spoke, others only silence, but all agreed that within that silence something divine stirred. The Persians weren't alone. Across the mountains in Assyria, clay tablets from nearly 3,000 years ago list cannabis among healing herbs to drive out the spirit that seizes a man's mind. In Egypt, healers blended it into ointments to treat inflammation and eye disease. In the Papyrus Ebers, dated around 1500 BC, one recipe calls for hemp ground in honey to soothe pain. In every place it landed, the plant changed accent, but kept meaning. It healed. It eased. It helped people see beyond what hurt them. Then came the Greeks, curious as always, dissecting everything, including pleasure. Herodotus wrote of the Scythians' smoky rituals with amusement, but by the 4th century BC, cannabis had found its way into Greek medicine. The physician Dioscorides, personal doctor to Emperor Nero, prescribed it for earaches and cramps, though he warned, "Too much will make one heavy of head." Wise words, 2 millennia early. From Greece, it slipped quietly into Rome. The Romans, ever practical, saw less divinity and more utility. They spun hemp into ropes and sails that carried their ships across the Mediterranean. Without it, Rome might never have ruled the sea. Soldiers used hemp oil on wounds, and physicians in the baths mixed it with wine for aching muscles. The empire, though it never worshipped the plant, built with it just as China once had. And so, by the dawn of the first millennium, cannabis had traveled farther than any empire's flag. It had been incense, medicine, rope, paper, and prayer. It had crossed borders drawn by kings and languages carved in stone, surviving every shift of power. That's the beauty of it. Cannabis wasn't spread by armies. It was spread by people, sailors, nomads, healers, dreamers. It didn't belong to any single faith or kingdom. It belonged to the small, stubborn hope that somewhere out there, nature had left us a cure for the heaviness of being human. Imagine those travelers resting by the fire at night, the camels groaning softly, the stars so bright they hum. Someone pulls a bundle of dried leaves from his pack, tosses it into the embers, and a faint green smoke curls upward. For a moment, strangers who share no language begin to laugh. They don't know it yet, but they're participating in one of the first global rituals, one that crosses deserts and dynasties alike. From here, the story will reach new shores, Byzantium, Arabia, and then the world of Islam, where the plant would meet philosophy, poetry, and law. It would become sacred again and then forbidden again. Because that's how history works. We love, we fear, we rediscover, and somewhere always the smoke keeps rising. By the time the first minarets began to rise over Persia, the plant had already made itself at home. The desert winds carried its scent through bazaars, caravans, and courtyards. And as the Islamic Golden Age dawned, between the 8th and 13th centuries, cannabis found new companions, scholars, philosophers, and poets. In an age that prized wisdom and wordplay, it became not just a medicine, but a metaphor. It was called hashish now, from the Arabic grass. And just as Arabic calligraphy turned words into art, the people who used hashish began turning thoughts into visions. You might have heard the name Sufi, the mystics of Islam, seekers of direct union with the divine. They weren't much interested in rules or rituals. They wanted experience, the feeling of God's breath in their lungs. For some, that feeling came through fasting or dance. For others, through the smoke of a green leaf. There's an old Sufi tale about a wandering saint who came across a group of laborers resting in the shade, sharing a small clay pipe. When they offered it to him, he smiled and said, "Whatever brings you closer to joy cannot be far from God." He took a single puff, exhaled, and laughed like a child seeing the world for the first time. It's easy to romanticize that, but the truth is more complicated. Within the same culture that produced those ecstatic mystics also rose powerful jurists. men who built the framework of Islamic law. They debated endlessly. If wine was forbidden, what about hashish? It didn't intoxicate in the same way. It didn't dull the body, only lightened the spirit. Was that sin or insight? By the 13th century, the argument had reached the scholars of Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. Some outlawed it completely, others allowed it in moderation, and a few, mostly poets, ignored the debate altogether. For them, hashish was muse and medicine alike. One Egyptian writer of the Mamluk era described it with both humor and awe. It makes the poor forget their hunger and the weary man laugh at his worries. It is a gift for those whom fortune has forgotten. Another cautioned that it leads men to idleness. But his tone reads more like envy than warning. It's here, in these centuries, that the word hashishin first appeared, supposedly describing a sect of assassins who, according to legend, used hashish before missions. Modern historians doubt the story. It was likely propaganda spread by their enemies. But the myth stuck, giving us the word assassin itself, a linguistic relic born from smoke and fear. In reality, most hashish users weren't killers or mystics. They were workers, stonemasons, porters, farmers, men whose lives were heavy and who found in the plant a moment of softness. After long days in the blinding sun, they would sit in tea houses, pass a clay bowl, and talk about nothing, or everything. Meanwhile, the poets, Rumi, Hafiz, Omar Khayyam, though they rarely named it directly, spoke in metaphors that sound suspiciously green. "I am the smoke rising from love's fire," wrote Hafiz, "drunk on what cannot be poured." Was he talking about wine, spirit, or something else entirely? The line between divine intoxication and earthly delight blurred until it hardly mattered. Through these centuries, cannabis lived a double life. In one hand, it was prayer. In the other, crime. It was sung about in poetry and banned in sermons, but it never disappeared. No empire ever fully erased it. For every ruler who outlawed it, a gardener quietly replanted it. For every scholar who condemned it, a poet wrote its defense. And somewhere in the corner of a smoky courtyard, a man with calloused hands took a slow breath, closed his eyes, and just for a moment felt infinite. That's the paradox of history. The more societies tried to contain cannabis, the more it slipped through their fingers. Next, we'll follow it across the sea to the empires that measured their power in ships, sails, and ropes. Because the next chapter of this story isn't mystical at all. It's maritime. Now the scent of cardamom fades. The hum of Persian markets dissolves into a different kind of rhythm. The creak of wood, the slap of waves, the groan of ropes pulled taut by salt and wind. We've reached the age of sail, and suddenly cannabis isn't about mysticism anymore. It's about empire. By the dawn of the 15th century, the old world had grown restless. Kings wanted colonies, merchants wanted oceans, and ships became the new weapons of ambition. But no ship could move without sails, no sails without rope, and no rope without hemp. Every plank that touched the sea was tied together by this plant. Hemp rigging held the masts. Hemp canvas caught the wind. Hemp caulking sealed the gaps. Even the uniforms of sailors were woven from it. To travel from Lisbon to Calcutta or from London to the Caribbean was to travel inside a floating field of cannabis. In England, Queen Elizabeth I demanded that every landowner plant hemp for the good of the Navy. Failure to do so could cost you a fine or worse. During the reign of her successor, King James III, the empire consumed so much hemp that colonists were ordered to grow it in Virginia and Massachusetts. Hemp was not a luxury crop, it was the spine of civilization. Imagine the docks of London in the 1600s, barrels rolling, gulls screaming, sailors swearing in 12 accents. The air smells of tar and salt, and everywhere you look, ropes, thick, braided, unbreakable. The might of an empire resting in the hands of hemp spinners. And across the ocean in the new colonies, farmers obeyed. They planted row after row of the same plant their ancestors once used for medicine and prayer. Now, it was patriotism. Hemp paid taxes, built ships, won wars. When the American colonies rebelled against Britain, the first American flags were likely sewn from hemp cloth. Even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson grew it, recording yields in their journals like proud gardeners. It's tempting to see irony there, a plant that once helped monks seek enlightenment now driving imperial conquest. But history rarely gives us clean contrasts. Hemp wasn't holy or evil, it was simply indispensable. And in that practicality, it became invisible. No one thought of the plant as mystical anymore. It was rope, it was cloth, it was just another part of life. But quietly, something else was happening. As hemp sailed across oceans, another form of cannabis, its more intoxicating cousin, was being carried along by traders, soldiers, and enslaved people from Asia and Africa. While Europe valued the stalk, the rest of the world cherished the flower. The West had found its industrial workhorse. The East still kept its healer and dreamer. When the two met again centuries later, they would no longer recognize each other. By the 18th century, ships made from hemp ropes and sails had circled the globe, mapping continents, enslaving nations, building empires that would last for centuries and unravel just as slowly. The plant that once bound the sails of peace had become the fiber of conquest. Yet, as always, it endured. When wars ended and ships rotted, hemp continued to grow in fields. Farmers who had no idea of its ancient history harvested it without ceremony. They didn't know it had once been sacred to gods, burned by warriors, or praised by poets. To them, it was just another crop that paid the bills. That's what history does. It buries the divine under the ordinary. But even buried things sprout again. Soon, the age of sail would give way to the age of industry. Machines would replace hands, steam would replace wind, and hemp, ancient, humble hemp, would face its first real rival, cotton, cheap and politically powerful. And as cotton rose, hemp began to fade from sight, not because it failed, but because the world forgot how much it owed to a single green stalk. By the early 19th century, the world had changed its rhythm. The creak of sails gave way to the hiss of steam, and the smell of salt was replaced by coal smoke. Empires that once measured power in rope and canvas now measured it in iron and cotton. And hemp, the silent worker of history, began to vanish from view. In America, fields that once grew hemp for the Navy were now blanketed in white fiber. Cotton had arrived, lighter, easier to spin, cheaper to process. The invention of the cotton gin made it a king among crops. Hemp was tougher, but slow to clean, labor-heavy, and stubborn. Industrialization loved speed more than loyalty, and so hemp was quietly left behind. Yet, even as its economic importance faded, the other half of cannabis, the psychoactive side, was stirring again. In India, buying still flowed during festivals. In the Middle East, hashish drifted through coffee houses. Sailors, soldiers, and merchants carried it across seas like a secret, tucked into pockets, wrapped in cloth. By the 1840s, it reached Europe again, this time not as rope, but as curiosity. In Paris, a group of writers and artists formed the Club des Hachichans. Among them were Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, and Alexandre Dumas, men whose imaginations already wandered far beyond reason. They met in a candlelit apartment near the Seine, wearing velvet coats, eating hashish mixed into honey and pistachios. They called it Dawamesque, and they swore it opened doors no dream could reach. Baudelaire wrote that hashish was a paradise artificial, a mirror that showed the soul enlarged. Hugo said it revealed the infinity of the moment. They treated it like alchemy, not vice, though of course not everyone approved. Outside their small circle, the respectable world raised its eyebrows and muttered about decadence. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Queen Victoria's personal physician prescribed cannabis tincture for menstrual pain. In the hospitals of London, doctors mixed it into tonics for insomnia, migraines, and melancholy. To them it was medicine, pure and simple. Bottles labeled Cannabis Indica lined pharmacy shelves beside laudanum and morphine. And then, almost without warning, the tide turned. The Victorian era was obsessed with morality. The same society that built opium dens also outlawed pleasure. To be sober was civilized. To be altered was shameful. Scientists began warning of insanity induced by Indian hemp. Newspapers published lurid tales of madness and crime. In 1876, one British officer in Egypt wrote a report claiming hashish turns men into beasts. He might have believed it, or he might have been trying to explain away the empire's own anxieties. Either way, the myth stuck. The plant that had built ships, healed bodies, inspired poets, and fed empires was suddenly dangerous, not because it had changed, but because the world had. Industry demanded discipline, religion demanded purity, and politics demanded control. In 1894, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, a 7-volume British investigation, spent years studying cannabis and concluded that moderate use caused little harm. But by then, the moral panic was already too loud. No one wanted facts. They wanted order. And so, step by step, the plant that once sailed with kings was pushed into the shadows. Laws replaced rituals. Fear replaced familiarity. Yet history is stubborn. Every time humanity tries to erase cannabis, it grows back, sometimes in soil, sometimes in memory. Even in the factories and cities of the 19th century, where the air reeked of iron and ambition, some workers still kept small pipes tucked into their pockets. After long shifts, they would step outside, light a match, and let a thin ribbon of smoke curl into the night. Maybe it wasn't rebellion. Maybe it was remembrance, a quiet nod to every hunter, healer, and poet who ever took a breath and found peace in the same ancient leaf. The 20th century would soon come, and with it, a war not of nations but of narratives, truth versus fear, science versus propaganda. The plant had survived empires. Could it survive the modern world? The dawn of the 20th century arrived not with incense or poetry, but with paperwork. New laws, new borders, new fears. The world had begun to label everything, even pleasure, and soon cannabis, once a humble plant that served gods and empires alike, found itself accused of crimes it never committed. In the early 1900s, the United States was expanding faster than it could understand itself. Immigrants were arriving from Mexico, bringing food, language, music, and marijuana. The word itself was foreign, exotic, and therefore suspicious. In the newspapers of the 1910s, marijuana appeared not as medicine, but as menace. The irony? Americans had already been using cannabis for decades, just under another name. Hemp extract, Indian hemp tincture, cannabis oil. The same plant repackaged as danger. All it took was a change of spelling and a few headlines to turn an ancient medicine into a public enemy. By 1930, fear had found its salesman, Harry Anslinger, head of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. A man of ambition and prejudice, he saw cannabis as a career opportunity wrapped in smoke. His speeches were fiery, his evidence flimsy. He declared that marijuana made men forget their souls, drove women to madness, and turned jazz musicians into criminals. He needed villains to sell his crusade, and he found them in the poorest, most marginalized communities. Mexican laborers, black artists, anyone whose existence already unsettled polite society. He flooded newspapers with horror stories: marijuana fiend kills family, jazz madness from hemp cigarettes. Never mind that most were exaggerated or invented. The headlines did their job. In 1936, Hollywood joined in with Reefer Madness, a film so hysterical it now plays like dark comedy. Wide-eyed teenagers smoke a joint, then spiral into violence, madness, and death. The message was clear. This wasn't about health. It was about control. 3 years later, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively outlawed the plant. Overnight, the same farmers who once supplied hemp for rope and fabric became criminals. The same pharmacies that once sold cannabis tinctures swept them from shelves. A silence fell. World War II briefly broke that silence. With supplies cut off from Asia, the U.S. government launched the Hemp for Victory campaign, urging farmers to grow hemp again for military ropes and parachute webbing. Patriotic posters showed smiling farmers harvesting fields of green. But when the war ended, the tolerance did too. The fields were burned, the posters destroyed, and the word marijuana reclaimed its stigma. Then came the 1950s, a decade of conformity. White picket fences, pressed suits, and fear of anything that smelled like rebellion. Cannabis became shorthand for danger, degeneracy, and delinquency. But underneath the quiet suburban lawns, change was germinating. The children of that generation would grow up asking questions their parents avoided, and by the 1960s, those questions would bloom into revolution. What if the problem wasn't the plant? What if the problem was the fear? From the ashes of prohibition, a counterculture would soon rise, one that didn't just inhale smoke, but defiance itself. The same leaf once burned in temples and ships was about to become the symbol of something far larger: freedom. The 1960s didn't arrive quietly. They crashed into history like a drumbeat. Cities pulsed with music, protest, and the smell of something sweet, burning in parks and basements. The children of soldiers and factory workers no longer wanted the lives their parents built. They wanted feeling. They wanted truth. And for many, truth came rolled into paper. It's strange how history circles back. The same plant that once connected Sufi mystics to God and Scythian warriors to their ancestors now connected college kids to themselves. It was no longer just a medicine or fiber, it was a mirror. When the world seemed rigid, cannabis whispered, "Breathe." The American government, of course, didn't like that whisper. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, classifying marijuana as a Schedule Y drug, the same category as heroin, officially defined as having no accepted medical use. It was a political move disguised as science, meant to silence a generation that wouldn't stop questioning authority. Nixon's aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted it outright. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." And so began the war on drugs, a war not on substances, but on people. Police raids swept through neighborhoods. Families were torn apart. Arrests for marijuana possession skyrocketed, from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands each year. Meanwhile, in the same laboratories that once studied its medical benefits, research funding dried up. The plant became a ghost again, spoken of only in whispers. But the counterculture refused to vanish. In 1967, at the Human Bee Inn in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, 30,000 people gathered beneath the fog to listen to poetry, protest war, and share smoke in open daylight. They called it the Summer of Love. And love, though messy, idealistic, sometimes naive, proved harder to outlaw than any plant. By the 1970s, music carried the message further. Bob Marley, with his voice like sunlight through smoke, told the world that herb is the healing of the nation. His songs turned cannabis from a criminal act into a prayer for unity, and through reggae, that prayer circled the globe. Even in America, cracks began to show in the wall of fear. States like Oregon and Alaska softened their penalties. Scientists quietly resumed research, rediscovering what ancient healers had always known, that cannabis eased pain, nausea, and anxiety without the ruinous cost of opiates. But for every step forward came 2 steps back. The 1980s arrived with a new slogan, "Just say no." Under President Ronald Reagan, penalties grew harsher, prisons fuller. Television showed mugshots of teenagers in handcuffs. A generation raised on peace and music watched as the green leaf of rebellion became a badge of criminality once again. And yet, even then, it never disappeared. It waited quietly in basements, attics, and college dorms. It passed between hands at concerts, in whispered laughter, in moments of grief and hope. Because no matter how many times humanity tried to bury cannabis, it kept growing back. By the 1990s, the tide was turning again. Scientists had discovered the endocannabinoid system, the network of receptors in our brains and bodies that cannabis seemed designed to fit, like a key long lost to history. The plant wasn't an intruder. It was part of us. It was almost poetic. After centuries of exile, humanity had rediscovered the truth that ancient civilizations already knew. Cannabis was not the enemy. It was a teacher. The last part of this story, our story, belongs to the modern age, a century that learned to see through smoke and finally remember what it had forgotten. By the time the 21st century began, the war on cannabis had lasted longer than most actual wars. Entire generations had grown up fearing a plant they had never seen outside of headlines and police photos. But history, as always, has its own rhythm, and eventually it hums back to balance. The return began quietly, not in palaces or parliaments, but in hospital rooms. A cancer patient in California discovered she could eat again after smoking. A veteran found his nightmares softened. A child with epilepsy stopped seizing when given a few drops of cannabis oil. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of survival. By 1996, California became the first U.S. state to legalize medical marijuana. It was a whisper that grew into a roar. Soon, other states followed: Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Maine. Scientists stepped out of the shadows and began publishing studies once considered taboo. Pain relief, inflammation, anxiety, sleep, PTSD. Everywhere they looked, the plant seemed to heal what modern life had broken. And then, something even stranger happened. The public, weary of fear-mongering, began to laugh again. Old propaganda films like Reefer Madness resurfaced, not as warnings, but as comedy. People realized the absurdity of a century-long panic. The same governments that once grew hemp for war now debated its taxation. The same news anchors who once called it the devil's weed now reported on billion-dollar cannabis companies listed on Wall Street. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to fully legalize recreational use. Crowds gathered in the cold December air, counting down the minutes until midnight like it was New Year's Eve. When the clock struck 12, they didn't riot or rebel. They simply lit up, smiled, and watched the smoke curl toward the stars. The irony was exquisite. The same plant that once fueled empires, inspired monks, and terrified politicians had become a business, a medicine, and a movement all at once. Across the ocean, Canada followed, then Uruguay, then parts of Europe. Bit by bit, stigma unraveled into science. Farmers who once whispered about hemp now grew it openly again. This time, not for ships, but for sustainable textiles, biofuel, even construction. In laboratories, researchers explored cannabinoids that could ease chronic pain without addiction. The circle had finally closed. But here's the beautiful twist. For all our modern sophistication, we've come back to the same truth ancient people already knew. Cannabis, at its heart, is about connection. To body, to mind, to nature, to one another. The Scythians burned it to speak with their ancestors. The Hindus drank it to speak with their gods. The Taoists inhaled it to merge with the universe. And today, in a quiet living room, someone smokes not to escape, but to exhale, to be still, to think, to feel human again. It's almost funny, isn't it? We built empires with this plant, then banned it, then built empires again around banning it. Now we're building new ones by bringing it back. In a world obsessed with progress, maybe cannabis reminds us that not every solution comes from invention. Some come from remembrance. So here we are, full circle. From the campfire in ancient Siberia to the glass towers of modern cities, the same smoke still drifts upward. It smells of earth and patience. It carries laughter, ritual, medicine, rebellion, and relief. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear that first spark again, the one that started it all. A crackle in the dark, a leaf meeting flame, 7,000 years of history rising in a single breath. The story of a plant and the people who kept finding themselves inside its smoke. Sleep now, the fire's still warm. The story, like the plant, is still growing.